Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. And today we're actually going to get into a topic that I wanted to get into for a while, and I mentioned a while back that it's something I was planning on diving into, but I never had a chance to until now, and that is watches. So obviously, you know, this channel is about not only improvement, self-improvement and whatnot, but it dives a little bit into things like style to a small degree, or just part of your image and whatnot. So part of that is accessorizing, and specifically for men, though women can get into watches as well, but specifically for men, because we don't really have a lot of jewelry options. Our main sense of ornament or accessory is a watch, and it's our primary one. And though sometimes we might dress things up with a bracelet of whatever type of material, whether it's leather, whether it's, you know, a type of rubber or some type of metal or whatever the case is. And sometimes we might wear a chain or, you know, a male necklace or something of that sort. Our primary form of accessory or jewelry is a watch. So with that being said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up into two parts, though they will be titled differently. And the first one is going to be on the culture or the perception of that culture of watches. And what I mean by that, or breaking into that, is that I'm breaking things down into, generally for the most part, three different groupings. General population, then the watch community population, and then entertainers or slash hip hop perspective on it. And the reason why, even though entertainers is a broad term, but then I dive into the hip hop aspect of it, is because of the influencers and where that takes it. Because I was having a discussion with a relative of mine, and who is very big into into things of like that aspect of culture, and I kind of want to relate that to the fact that when it comes to entertainers and entertainment, though you have some people just wear a watch because they like the style of it, whatever the case is, but certain types of entertainment, specifically hip hop, has a different influence on watches, and that also affects the perception when it comes to how people view things. And you'll see what I mean when I dive deeper into it. But starting off in general, so to the general population who don't really know much about watches, essentially what you have is they're gonna know certain brands. They're gonna know brands like, say, on your basic end, and people who aren't really big into watches, they themselves dive into realms of, do I just want to watch a regular, nice, average watch just to kind of put on and and have something nice to wear when I go out. Maybe I want to get dressed up, which is fine. You don't need an expensive brand or anything of that sort. And they might go and say, I just want a regular brand. I can go into a Macy's and purchase, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, because I want to make it clear there's nothing wrong with any level of watches. But I'm not going to dive heavy into the tiers. I'm going to do that in the next video. But essentially, a person who is not looking to spend that much money, and maybe somewhere in the range of $100 to maybe $300 now be considered expensive for them, simply because they're not into watches. Because some people will go and say, well, what's considered expensive, what's not? Well, if you're not into something, then of course spending a decent amount of money on it is going to feel expensive. If you are into something, then they're not going to consider that very expensive, because that is your poison, as they say, when they say pick your poison. So with that being said, the average person who might be just saying, I just want a watch to go out, a little nice watch, whatever the case is, they might look at brands such as Hamilton, Tissot, or Tissot, depending on how you want to pronounce it, Seiko, or Citizen, and often those watches are going to probably be, well, Hamilton and Tissot get Tissot. I'm just going to call it Tissot. Hamilton and Tissot get into, they mostly have automatics from my understanding of it. And if you're not familiar with what an automatic watch is, so an automatic watch versus a quartz watch is anything with a battery. Even if it's solar powered, it still uses a battery. That's considered a quartz watch. An automatic watch or mechanical watch is one where it has a movement in it that's very similar to, I guess you could say, a pendulum type of clock, where the motion of the pendulum and that circle that's winding over there, you can't really see if that's moving, is like a mini pendulum. And essentially that is what makes the watch move, and that gets wound up by, when it's an automatic, there's a rotor. That rotor right there, let me try to move it. That rotor that's slightly, I can't really get it to spin, but you see it moving, that winds, and then that powers the little spinning golden circle that you see there. And that is, the golden circle is the equivalent of the pendulum. The rotor is kind of the equivalent of, on those old grandfather clocks with pendulums, you pulling the chain to I'm going too deep with it, but essentially it's like you pulling a lever to wind it up and then letting the pendulum go. Now, a mechanical doesn't have that rotor on the back, so you would then have to manually wind it up to get the juice flowing, and then it would make that pendulum, which is that circle, go on its own. That's not the term that it's normally used, but I say that for non-watch people to have a better understanding of it. You can view that as like a pendulum. So anyway, knowing that difference, Hamilton and Tissot use automatic mostly, even though you can find them somewhere in that price range of maybe like mid $200s to $500, especially on the gray market for a decent watch. Seiko and Citizen, most people, when they look to buy one of those as an average person, you're usually looking at a quartz watch, battery operated, which is fine. And you can have either one of those four options or other brands, but I'm just mentioning those four as a starter position where you have a nice watch, you go out, you know, you get dressed up, it looks nice on your wrist. You know, if someone's wearing something like a Seiko and, you know, you, and I'm sorry, that's a Citizen. If someone's wearing, like I say, a Citizen, and you know, are dressed up nice, it's going to look nice on your wrist regardless. It's a piece of metal on your wrist. It's going to look nice regardless. I don't care what anybody says. And someone starts getting, you know, brand snobbery. Some people get into that, and I'll get into that later about, you know, with the whole perception and stuff like that about things when we get into the watch population of people. But it's going to look nice regardless. And so there's nothing wrong with that within that tier. Now, also the or you can, like I said, you can go into something like a Seiko if you want something automatic. Seiko will do quartz as well, or you can get into a Tissot or a Hamilton, which also can be automatic. Nice watch, will look very nice, nothing wrong with it, and it'll be for a decent price. Now you also then have within the general population group of people, the higher tier levels, which I want to point out four brands that I think, and this is slowly starting to shift now, but maybe about 3 years ago, these were the primary four brands that the general population who knew nothing, I'm not going to say nothing about watches, but knew very little about watches, would gravitate to as a little hierarchy of the most quote unquote popular luxury brand watches, simply because they're the ones that are highly marketed, yet hit a certain limit within budget that people can attain. And so starting from the bottom, then going up, you have Tag Heuer, which is generally a brand that's often sometimes sold in, can be sold, I think, in some Macy's, some other store department brands that are not necessarily watch, like 100% just a watch store or watch boutique only. They'll be, you know, sell clothes and other things, and then they'll also sell watches. Breitling, which at that point starts going into like only into a specific watch store, so a store that will sell multiple brands of watches, or maybe a store that just sells Breitling. Omega, which is the next tier up from that, which some people know. Surprisingly, I know some regular people that I've asked that I know that are friends and family, and some of them are like, I heard of Omega, but I don't really know it all too well. Some people in the same might apply to Breitling. So there's a certain level where the average person will know of it, and then some people kind of don't. And that's where you kind of see the difference between someone who is maybe more interested in watches or less interested in watches, but is still part of the general population because they don't collect watches. And then Rolex is the top of that group of four luxury brands. You have Rolex on the top. Now Rolex is a very special brand, and I'll tell you why in a few, but Rolex pretty much is the top of that, where if you don't really know anything about watches, you're going to say, okay, well, the top tier for the average person is going to be Rolex. Now the reason why I say that Rolex is a special brand is because they are more known than any other watch brand, or especially luxury watch brand, even though they aren't actually the most expensive. But so for the general population, their perception is that Rolex is the top, because on a popularity or knowledge base, as far as being aware of what watch brands exist out there, Rolex is the top watch brand. It is the highest ceiling that you can attain for the general population of people who do not know about watches. And so with that said, then you come into and I'm not going to go into detail of explaining, like I said before, about in the beginning stages of just having a nice watch and this and that. Obviously you get it as you go up in the tier. You know you have a nice watch and it's a luxury watch. You're buying it for the status of that watch. And generally speaking, just to run through that list one more time, someone who's just getting into things and might have maybe somewhere between like $1,000 to like maybe $2,000 to spend. They might get a Tag Heuer, and they have that level of brand reputation with it. Now, I also want to reiterate, these four brands, I feel, in my opinion, some people will argue differently, are the most known luxury brands to the general population, not the watch community, because I know a lot of watch community guys will jump into the video and say these are not the most popular brands. I'm not talking about people who know about watches, but people who do not know about watches. These four brands are probably the most known luxury brands, outside of one other brand I would include in that, but I don't put them in this list, and that is Cartier, because Cartier is more known as a jewelry company, but is equally as popular as either one of these four watches. But generally, when someone thinks I want to buy a watch and not a piece of jewelry, which women might gravitate towards the Cartier, but men will go and say one of these four brands if you do not know about watches and you want to buy a luxury watch. So continuing where I was saying, Tag would be somewhere in the range of $1,000 to $2,000. If a person's looking to spend that, they will probably say, I will go with the Tag. Someone looking to spend somewhere in that $2,000 to $3,000 range, maybe even $4,000, they will say or consider Breitling. Someone looking to spend somewhere in that $3,000 to maybe $5,000 range will probably take a look at Omega. And then someone looking to spend in that $7,000 to $10,000 range is probably considering Rolex. And it's not that to say none of these brands have different price ranges than that. Rolex has their starting point watch is about $5,500 or about $6,000. But generally speaking, from the perception of the average person who's not into watches, their thought process is, if I'm looking at a Rolex, I'm spending somewhere around $10,000. And generally speaking, someone who's ready to buy a Rolex from the general population is not thinking about their baseline watch. They can, but is generally thinking, I have a particular one I'm looking at, and that's going to be the only one I buy because I'm not a big watch person, and so I'm going to buy one of them, and the one I'm going to buy is probably going to be somewhere in that price range of $8,000 to probably $10,000. With that being said, those four I feel are the most popular in terms of for the general population when it comes to luxury brands. Now, jumping into the watch population or the watch community, these people have a different perspective on things because they're more in the know. There'll be brands that they're more into that might be a little more artsy, but it's less known. They'll be into, they'll know of brands that are higher up on the tier that go beyond the four that I just mentioned and go beyond Rolex, not in terms of general popularity to the masses, but is a higher price range, a higher craftsmanship. And those individuals in the watch community aren't necessarily, this is not, basing on whether they have a lot of money or don't have a lot of money, but they're just in the know. So whatever they do decide to collect, whether it's on the more affordable end, it's a more articulated collection when they do collect, because someone who's part of the watch community is going to be a collector, and generally speaking, and they're going to have a collection where they say, well, maybe I can only afford something in the $500, $600 range. They may have multiple Seikos, but they're going to have Seikos that are not quartz. They're going to have Seikos that are automatic, which you can see here. This one right here, the Seiko is sweeping. It's automatic. They might go in that realm. They'll say, okay, and just generally speaking, for the most part, automatic or mechanical watch is usually seen as more sophisticated than a quartz watch, generally speaking. And generally speaking, it is, because it requires more craftsmanship. Whether it's machine built or handmade, it still requires more in it than a quartz watch, generally speaking. I say that because there's some high-end quartz watches that are designed and put together with more work and detail than a very low-end mechanical or automatic watch. So with that being said, though, generally speaking, someone's going to see the automatic is a little more prestigious. So you might have someone who they have a budget somewhere within that $500 range every now and then. And so they'll get, every year, maybe a watch that's like $300, $200, $500, and they're automatics. So I say that to say that their knowledge of being more in the know means they're going to have a more sophisticated taste in terms of craftsmanship than, say, somebody who is just part of the general population. Also, I want to just dial right back real quick and say that a general population, when it comes to their perception of watches, might also think that a fashion watch which is a term that's coined that says, something that may have a fashion brand on it, like say Gucci or something like that. They slap their brand on something that's like maybe a $30 or $40 or $50 watch, and they'll charge it for like $200 a watch. That is because it's a fashion brand. You're paying for the brand and not the actual the quality of the watch. So I say that to say that's another thing when I say the term that someone from the watch community might have a more sophisticated taste. What I mean by that simply is that they know the difference between a watch that's just selling for the brand or a fashion watch versus an actual watch of quality that they're buying into, which the brand of the watch they're buying into that has better quality, like say a Seiko, may not be to the masses as appealing as say like a Gucci watch, but underneath the hood has a lot more going on the watch or in the watch than that Gucci watch, for example. And I'm not trying to knock any fashion brand. I'm just pointing out the perception that people have from the general population versus the watch community. Also in the watch community, you're going to have people who, like I said, there's some quote unquote artistic brands, like we'll say, so IWC, Zenith, Jaeger-LeCoultre, or however you pronounce it. I know I'm probably butchering it a little bit, but JLC for short. Some people say Jaeger-LeCoultre or LeCoultre, but JLC for short. Grand Seiko, which is a higher level of Seiko. And I'm going to throw Cartier inside this realm as well, even though Cartier is very popular because it is a jewelry brand. And people call it a fashion brand, but not in the way you would call like Gucci doing a fashion brand in terms of watches or something like that, or Michael Kors, because the watches are actually bad quality, generally speaking, for the price, where And I'm not knocking them. I'm just saying for the price you're paying, they don't have a certain level of quality. You're paying for the brand name. With Cartier, you're not just paying for the brand name. There's a craftsmanship within the way that the design of the watch is done. And they may outsource most of their movements. And someone can leave a comment down below if that is true or not, but I believe that's the case. They may outsource a lot of their movements, but at the same time, whether it's quartz or automatic, what I'm saying, that's the watch movement. But they're going to outsource a quality movement, and the quality and the craftsmanship of the actual design of the watch is of a higher quality level. So it puts it into a different place than just your general fashion brand. But with that being said, those ones that I just mentioned, Cartier, IWC, Zenith, JLC, Grand Seiko, these are brands that are equal for the most part to, say, Omega or Rolex in price range, but a little more off the beaten path, where your average consumer wouldn't have really heard of them as much. Cartier is the exception. They would have heard of it, but for men, they're probably not going to go in that direction as much as women would. But generally speaking, most people wouldn't have heard of these brands as much, but at the same time, they're the equivalent of, say, a Rolex. But the only thing about it is that perception-wise, the perception is not as big. So the watch community will appreciate these watches as the equivalent to a Rolex, where the general population would just go, well, I know the brand Rolex, so if I'm spending $7,000, $8,000, I want to get the thing that everybody knows, versus I got the brand that no one else knows about, but I appreciate it on my own because I like it as an artistic statement, or the craftsmanship in it. So the watch community will know of such brands like that when they're searching on that tier of price range. Now, with that being said as well, nonetheless, they're going to still be aware of the brands that are very popular and known to the public, which is also why they sometimes in the watch community might kind of view the more known brands, because a lot of people do this in many different hobbies, whatever's known or mainstream, quote unquote, let me get my fingers in there, quote unquote, they then will say, I don't like it because everyone else knows about it, and I don't want to be down with that, which that's always been the case from the beginning of time with a lot of people when it comes to various hobbies. It's no different in the watch community. So sometimes that happens. So you'll have a person who says, I want a Grand Seiko over a Rolex. They're both great brands, great watches, but they might say, I don't want the thing that everyone else has. So sometimes you have that perception with things when it comes to the watch community. They'll also be more into, say, if they're on that lower level price range of, like, say, somewhere between $200, $500, they'll say, I want me a Seiko, maybe over a Citizen, because the Seiko, there's more automatic options and they want that. Or maybe they want the Seiko is a Japanese company, so a Citizen. Somebody might say, well, I want the Seikos that are only from Japan, or maybe the Citizens that are only from Japan and not sold in America, just because it's a little more different. No one else is going to have it. So you have that aspect of things. Then also too, you have, now I'm going to split this difference between the general population and then the watch community, that you have what's known as the Holy Trinity, that the watch community dubs as this term or this name, the Holy Trinity. And this is the watch brands that are the highest of the high. And those brands are Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, and Vacheron Constantin. And the thing about it is, these three brands are very expensive, the highest level of quality, the highest level of artisan, the highest level of whatever you could think of. And they're very expensive. But the watch community, they're going to know these brands because they are, aware of all the aspects of watch collecting. And whether you are the average guy who doesn't have a lot of money, you're aware of them. And if you are the guy who has a lot of money from the watch community, who's part of the watch community, you can afford them, and you go, okay, that's where I want to take my collection, and you can do that. And you'll know about it, you'll be aware of it, and like I said, regardless of what your finances are, you'll at least know about it if you're in the watch community. And that's the perception of the watch community. They at least know about everything in the watch world, even if they can't necessarily afford it. Now, the regular general population or non-watch collectors, these brands here of the Holy Trinity will not even be something that they're even on their radar, because they're not even, if they see someone walking down the street who has, say, an Audemars Piguet on, they may not even recognize it, let alone even know the name if someone told it to them. Because some of them will be like, I just know nothing about watches. And though anyone who's part of the watch community might think that's insane, how do you not know what this is? Others who are just regular average people, realistically, just may not know at all what those brands are. Like, and from people who are into the watch hobby would probably go, that's insane. But no, there are other people in the world who really just don't care about watches like that. Because obviously you can walk down the street and see some people don't even wear a watch at all, and they may wear an Apple Watch because that's more of an electronic thing, but they're not necessarily into watches, which is fine. I'm not knocking anything, just informing you. So to the average general person, Rolex, going back to what I was saying before, is the top end of it. If you were to spend on a Patek, which most people are not even going to be able to afford anyway, but say hypothetically you're an average general person just who's not into the watch community, and you buy a Patek, you could be walking around the street and you're going to say, this is not even worth it, because I spent like somewhere between $50,000, $70,000 on this, or whatever the price is, and no one even knows how much I paid for it. So the general person wants to show that this was the level that I've reached in life. It's a status symbol because our accessories are for that purpose, and would say, well, no one even knows how much I paid for it. They don't even know what this is. So why am I having a piece of jewelry or art or whatever you want to call it on my wrist, and no one even knows what it represents? Which is a valid feeling. I'm not going to knock it. Some people disagree with it, some people don't. I'm not here to judge it. I'm just simply saying that there's a lot of people who will feel that way. Whereas someone in the watch community will say, because I know of it, I know it's art, I know it's craft, I know what was put into it, they may not mind purchasing, especially if you're in that level of where, you are very well off, and you say, I want to roll in that type of group, that type of people who can afford that. To them, it's one of those things of like, if you know what I mean? You understand what it is. So it's not about appealing to the masses, because you're rolling in circles where they do understand that, especially if you're a watch person, you understand it. So you don't need someone else to know what level it is, because you know what level it is, and to the people who know of it, they are the circles you're going to roll with, the ones who actually know about it, generally speaking. So that's why I say for most people, Rolex would be the top end for the general population, because why would you want to buy something no one knows about if you're not into watches? And then you have the entertainment section, and I'm going to dive into the hip hop aspect of it in a moment. But for those people who are into entertainment from the hip hop culture aspect, but generally in entertainment is no different than, like, say, just a regular well-off or wealthy person. They just will buy a watch, they buy what they like. There's not too much cultural influence on what they're buying, other than the fact that I have a lot of money, so I can afford something very expensive, and I'm just going to buy something very expensive. Some of them get into it. It's someone who is in entertainment can also be part of the watch population, or the watch group of people, or maybe they're not, and that might affect some of the things that they buy. But for the most part, since they can afford and have a lot of money to spend, they will buy things on that upper echelon. Now the difference is where someone who's not a watch person but is an entertainer, or very well off, but for the most part I'm going to just say entertainer, and it's kind of applying to similar or the same thing. If they're not a watch person, they'll immediately go and say, well, I want a Rolex in my collection because everyone knows Rolex. But then also, if they're a little bit more, knowledgeable on things, they might say, and they're not a watch person, they're going to say, well, I know of Audemars Piguet, the Holy Trinity. I know about Patek Philippe. I know about Vacheron Constantin because the circles that I roll in, people have those kind of watches. But with that being said, they're not going to necessarily dive into the more artsy stuff. Now, somebody who is, not that those aren't artsy because they are in their quality, but also to the people who are entertainers or roll in those circles, the Holy Trinity to them is the equivalent of what Rolex is, and those four brands, Tag Heuer, Breitling, Omega, and Rolex is to the average person. That is what the Holy Trinity is for entertainers on that level. But when it comes to a more artsy aspect of things, sometimes you'll have some of the entertainers who are knowledgeable in watches might say, well, I do want an IWC, I do want a Cartier, maybe I want a Zenith or a JLC, maybe I want a Grand Seiko, because if I'm a watch person and I have money, I can dive into all these other brands that are more expensive, that are a little bit more, off the beaten path, or maybe even some other very artistic or sideways brands that are just as appealing as the Holy Trinity to a degree, but yet are not as known or more experimental or just off the beaten path. Someone who's a watch person and has the resources for it, like an entertainer, might do that. But then now I want to, and some of those brands could be things like a Lange Sohne, which some people consider it the forgotten child of the Holy Trinity because the quality of it is up there pretty much. The quality of a Lange Sohne is pretty much in the same realm as the Holy Trinity for the most part. But it is more of a brand that is even less known by the mainstream than, say, the Holy Trinity, which when it comes to in this realm of, like, say, entertainers and stuff like that, if you're a watch person, then, like I said, you're gonna know of such brands like that, or even such brands as Chopard, Piaget, and things of that sort, which also, like I said, is a more artistic aspect of things versus something that's a little more mainstream on that upper echelon, like Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, the Holy Trinity. But then coming to the hip hop culture of things, which I wanted to kind of dive into, you have hip hop will set the pace or set the standard because they will introduce trends or things that they want to get into. They want to be loud, they want to be big, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they will get into other brands that are things like Hublot or lately Richard Mille, which sometimes people might hate on Hublot because they're a newer brand. They might say they don't got the history, they're big, they're gaudy. The quality is there. They're as expensive sometimes more than Rolex, and maybe touching certain brands like JLC, Zenith, IWC, maybe even close to the Holy Trinity. But the idea is, people in hip hop, though, the perception some people might say is like, oh, their taste in watches are bad. It's not this, not very, whatever. For lack of a better word, their taste is not refined. But the thing about it is that they're trend setting, and part of the trend with that and with that culture is being loud, being big, experimenting with the new thing, not just just whatever's already out there. So though you'll have some of them will have like an Audemars, one of the Holy Trinities, or all of the Holy Trinities, but more so specifically, you'll have them jump on new trends, that speak loud and big, especially when back in the days, the common theme would be get, say, a Rolex and ice it out with a bunch of diamonds. But now the new form of that is just getting a more higher end big watch that's just in your face, not necessarily having all the diamonds, though they may still do that as well. But I say that to say they're a different breed of entertainer when it comes to how they collect watches. And though some of them will be more reserved and will get things like something from the Holy Trinity, they might have a more reserved collection, very similar to just a high-end watch collector, watch kind of guy, part of the watch community, who might be well off and have a similar taste to them. But then you also will have that some of them will have a more in your face collection that says, I want all the things that scream loud. So you have some brands, like I said before, Hublot, Richard Mille, that are all about being in your face, screaming in your face. And there's nothing wrong with that either, but that becomes the trend of it. And some people look at that as a little bit like, okay, well, it's over the top, but there's nothing wrong with anybody's taste when it comes to that. But just pointing out that that is an aspect of watch collecting from that perspective, from the entertainment perspective. So pretty much just to wrap everything up when it comes to this, like I said, this is pretty much just dissecting the culture of, the perception of watches and how the different groups view things or how they perceive things and what's considered what. This is just kind of like a general breakdown on that and how people view things. Not necessarily saying on an advice on how to collect. In the next video that I do, we're going to jump into the tiers of watches, and that's going to kind of go more into the collecting aspect. But this is really just touching on the culture and the way people perceive it. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next video.